Hello all, my name is Shivani Rajesh and I am going to take a lecture on torts. So the lecture has been divided into 4 parts. The first part talks about a little bit of introduction about the topic of torts, under which I am going to talk about what exactly is the meaning of the word torts. I am going to talk about what are the constituent elements of torts, and I will also be talking about tortious liability. After that, I am going to talk about general defenses which are available to the parties whenever they are accused of committing a tort. After that, I will deal with certain specific torts such as negligence, nuisance and trespass, after which we will finish off with remedies in the end. So now starting off with what exactly is the meaning of torts. Now the word torts is a word which is derived from the Latin word tortum. Tortum essentially means crooked behavior or twisted behavior. So in general, it basically means that it is something which is not the normal way of behaving in a society. Now when I say normal way of behaving in the society, I essentially refer to the expectations that each member in the society has from the individuals who are residing in the society, and these expectations come out of certain laws which are in place. These laws are in place essentially to protect the legal interests of certain people. So whenever we live in a society, all of us have certain interests. These interests can be individual interests or they can be private interests. For example, I have an interest in my reputation. I have an interest in the property that I own, and my interest basically requires that my enjoyment of my reputation or the enjoyment of my property should not be interfered with. When this is interfered, it basically goes against my interest. Now everyone in the society has their own reputation and has their own property in place, which is the reason why we need to come up with rights to protect these interests. If we do not give the rights to the people in order to protect their own interests with respect to various things such as their own body, their own reputation, their own property, then it will essentially lead to a situation where there can be someone who comes who interferes with the enjoyment of the person's property, or who comes and interferes with the bodily integrity of the person and causes damage to the person. So this is the reason why, for the purpose of protecting the interests of the individuals who are living in the society, there are certain rights which are granted to these individuals. And when these rights are granted to the individuals, there are essentially corresponding duties on someone else to not interfere with my legal right. So for example, I have the legal right of reputation, I have a right to protect my reputation. In such a situation, my right of protecting my reputation has a corresponding duty on someone else to not make a speech or to not say something which essentially goes against my reputation. So if someone involves in a defamatory speech against me, I have a right to take action against this third person because he has committed a breach of the duty which was imposed upon it for the purpose of saving my right or for the purpose of protecting my interests of reputation. And when such third person breaches this duty which is cast upon him, which corresponds to my legal right, that person is said to have committed a tort, he is said to have committed a wrong, and that is when the entire action, or that is when the entire law of torts comes into action. Alright. Now having talked about the fact that from all the things that I have said, the conclusion is that tort is a wrong. So whenever there is a wrong which is committed in the society, there is a tortious liability which can arise out of this wrong which has committed. What is a wrong? It is essentially someone not fulfilling their duty. Why does someone have to fulfill their duty? For the protection of someone else's right. And why is law protecting the rights of these people? Because law wants to protect their legitimate interests. Alright. So now moving on, talking about what exactly is torts. Now the thing that we have to realize is that torts is a civil wrong. Alright. It is not just any wrong. It is obviously a wrong, but it is more specifically a civil wrong. Now what do I mean when I say that torts is a civil wrong? A civil wrong essentially refers to a situation wherein once a person commits this wrong, a civil action lies against the person. So the person who is affected by the wrong which is committed by the other person can take a civil action against that person, and the civil action will lead to a civil remedy. Alright, a civil remedy essentially refers to damages, whereas a criminal remedy on the contrary refers to imprisonment or refers to fine. Alright, so when you talk about a civil wrong, the liability which arises out of it, or the remedy which is available against such a civil wrong, is payment of damages, or which is also called as compensation, or it can also be called as damages. And on the contrary, in case of a crime, the punishment that is given or the remedy which is available is imprisonment of the person who has committed a wrong, or ask the person to pay a fine. Now the thing which is to be noticed is that most of the actions, most of the wrongs which qualify to be a tort also at the same time qualify to be crimes which are either mentioned specifically under certain statutes such as Prevention of Corruption Act or any of the other statutes, or it can be a crime which is mentioned in the IPC itself, that is the Indian Penal Code. Now the question which arises is that if the same action of a person, the action of not fulfilling his legal duty, thereby committing a legal wrong, when this person is doing that particular action, that same action can qualify to be a civil wrong as well as a criminal wrong. If a civil wrong is acted upon, that is, an action is being taken against the person in the civil court, it shall be resulting into a civil remedy, whereas if the action is taken in the in the criminal court, it shall lead to a criminal remedy, which is essentially imprisonment or fine. Now the question is, why do we need these two separate systems, that is the civil justice system and the criminal justice system, for the purpose of the same action? The action is the same. For example, defamation can be considered, the act of defaming someone and harming that person's reputation can be considered as a tort as well, and it can be considered as a crime as well. So why do we need these two separate systems, justice systems? Why can't we just have crimes, or why can't we just have the civil wrongs? Why do we have these two justice systems existing together? The reason behind that is that there are various bases, or there are different bases on which a crime is punished in a criminal court and a tort is punished in a civil court. Alright. To give you an example of what exactly happens in a criminal court and a civil court, I would like to take the case of O.J. Simpson. Now Mr. O.J. Simpson was an American football player who was accused of killing his wife and the wife's friend. Alright. Now since he was accused of killing his wife and the wife's friend, he was essentially, there was a criminal trial which was going on against him, and after the criminal trial concluded, a civil case was also filed against Mr. O.J. Simpson for the same action of killing his wife. Under the crime, it was basically murder, and under the civil action, it was causing wrongful death of a person. Now, in the criminal trial which proceeded of Mr. O.J. Simpson was acquitted. That means he was not punished. He was considered to be innocent by the criminal court. However, when the civil case proceeded against Mr. O.J. Simpson, he was found guilty and he was asked to pay a huge compensation. Now the question is, what went wrong with the criminal trial and what actually happened in case of civil matter as to why he was found innocent in the criminal matter but guilty under the civil case. The reason behind the difference of treatment which was given for Mr. O.J. Simpson's case in criminal and civil matter was the fact that in a criminal case, a person's guilt has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That means there should be no other possibility of anything else happening apart from the fact that the person who is accused is the person who has committed the crime. So there is the burden of proof which is required to be proved by the prosecution in a criminal matter is beyond a reasonable doubt. That means there cannot be any doubt in the mind of the judge that maybe something else could have been the possibility. And in Mr. O.J. Simpson's case, incidentally, that exact thing happened, in the sense that, to give you a little bit of details about it, every evidence was against Mr. O.J. Simpson. His blood was found on the crime scene. His footprints were found on the crime scene. His belongings, his shoe was found on the crime scene. But the only thing that saved Mr. O.J. Simpson was the fact that there was a glove, a hand glove, which was found on the crime scene. And when Mr. O.J. Simpson was asked to try this glove, he could not. The glove did not fit his hand. So that is the reason why, just because of that one evidence which did not corroborate with the rest of the evidence, there was a doubt which was created in the minds of the jury that maybe Mr. O.J. Simpson is not the killer, because of which he got acquitted in the criminal case. But in the civil case, the burden of proof is not to prove the guilt of a person beyond a reasonable doubt. It is to prove in such a manner that there is a higher probability of the fact that the person has committed the crime. So that burden of proof is called as balance of probabilities, in the sense that you have to basically look at the situation from different perspectives, and you have to think about which is the most likely to have taken place. And if the guilt of the accused is the most likely event which has taken place, then the person will be found guilty in a criminal case. Alright, so although the action is the same, the criminal court has acquitted the person, and the only way in which the family of O.J. Simpson's wife got justice in the case was by way of a civil case, or by way of the civil action which was taken against Mr. O.J. Simpson. And this is the reason why we cannot have only a criminal justice system, because a criminal justice system might lead to a situation where people go scot-free and without getting punished, just because of tiny procedural issues, or because of a doubt which is created in the mind of the judge which says that maybe the person has not committed the crime. So that is why, in order to balance out the justice system, you need both civil and criminal justice system, and they are very different from each other. Now, talking about the next point as to why don't we have just a civil justice system then? If a civil case is easier to prove and the civil case is not going to lead to many people going off without a punishment when they have committed a crime, why do we need a criminal justice system at all? Why do we need IPC in place when we have torts? That is the question. But the answer to this question is that in a civil case, the remedy which is available is payment of compensation. Now, when you say that only have civil justice system and not a criminal justice system, you are essentially leading to a situation where all the rich people in the society are getting away scot-free by the acts that they have committed, the crimes that they have committed, by just payment of compensation. But on the other hand, the poor people of the society are the ones who will actually suffer because they will not be able to pay the compensation. So again, to balance out the situation, we cannot have just a civil justice system, we also need the criminal justice system, which is why torts and IPC, or torts and crimes, go hand in hand with each other, and both are required in equal measures. The next thing that I am going to essentially talk about is the constituent elements of torts. Now that we have talked about the fact that torts is something which is very important and we need torts to be in existence in our legal system, let's talk about what exactly is a tort. And whenever you talk about laws which are in place, the first thing that you look at is what is the constituent elements which are involved in the tort, which is in the action or in the law which is talked about. So in case of the law of torts, there are three constituent elements. If these three constituent elements are proved, then it can be said that a tort has been committed. Alright? So you can call it as ingredients, or you can call it as constituent elements. Both of the things are correct. Now in case of these constituent elements, as I have already mentioned, there are three constituent elements. The first one is the fact that there should be a wrongful act or a wrongful omission. I'll deal with the meanings in a while, but I'll just list out those three constituent elements first. So first of all, there has to be a wrongful act or a wrongful omission. The second thing that is important is the fact that this wrongful act or wrongful omission should cause a legal damage. What is a legal damage? We'll come to it. And the third thing that is essential is that for the purpose of the wrong which has been committed, there should be a remedy, a legal remedy which is available in order to make the wrong right. Alright. So the first element is basically a wrongful act or a wrongful omission. What do you mean by a wrongful act? Something which a person should not have done, but he has done it. So he has committed an act which should not have been committed by him. This is a wrongful act, or it's a wrongful action. Whereas on the other hand, something which a person should have done, but he has not done it, that is called as a wrongful omission. That means he should have done something, but he has not done that particular thing. So he has omitted to do a particular thing which should otherwise have been done by that particular person. So this is the reason why there are two things. It's not just an overt act. It is something, sometimes a torts can arise if I don't do anything at all as well. Alright. So that is something which has to be mentioned. So for example, a wrongful act could be an act of defaming someone. So when I speak, I'm doing something, I'm taking an action which is wrongful because it is breaching someone else's legal right to reputation. Or when I am trespassing against property, or when I am trespassing into the property of a person. Trespassing means entering into the property of a person without their permission. So when I am trespassing over a property which belongs to someone else, that will also be considered as a wrongful act, because I am overtly doing something which is wrong. Alright. On the other hand, what can you call as an omission? Now, to talk about a wrongful omission, I would like to refer to the case of Glasgow Corporation versus Taylor. Now, in the case of Glasgow Corporation versus Taylor, the situation was that there was a public park which was maintained by the municipal corporation of a particular area. Now, in this public park, that happens to be a poisonous tree which bore poisonous fruits, and one of these fruits was eaten by a child who was playing in the park, and he died because of eating that fruit. Now, the question was, or the action which was taken against by the parents of the child who died because of eating that poisonous fruit, was that the municipal corporation was under a duty to fence that particular poisonous tree, either to fence it or else remove it altogether. That poisonous tree should not have been there in the park, and this is a legal wrong which is committed on the part of the municipal corporation. The municipal corporation said that we have not done anything at all to actively cause the death of the child. The child died because he ate the fruit, and there was nothing that we have actively done. But in this case, the court held that the omission to fence the tree, that is the omission to take care that the tree's fruits are not eaten by people who are visiting the park, was something which should have been done by the municipal corporation. And because they did not do it, because there was an omission on the part of the municipal corporation was considered to have committed a tort that is in question. Alright, so that is why it is not just a wrongful action, it is also a wrongful omission which can cause a tort. The second constituent element that we talked about was legal damage. Now, this is again very important to talk about. Legal damage essentially refers to a situation wherein there has been an infringement of a legal right. Alright, so it has to be an infringement of a legal right. That is the only way in which you can prove legal damage. When I normally say the term damage, it can be actual damage as well. That means that I have lost some money, there is a monetary damage which is caused to me. I have gotten hurt on my body, this is again an actual damage which is caused to my body. That is not something that is entirely required in order to prove a tort. What is required is infringement of a legal right. That is when it shall be called as a legal damage, and actual damage is something which is not going to be referred to under torts. Now, if there is no infringement of this legal right, and if there is only a damage which is caused, an actual damage which is caused, actual damage meaning thereby either a monetary damage or a physical damage or mental damage, any of the other things, without the infringement of a legal right, then that particular action which has caused that particular damage shall not be considered as actionable under the law of torts. Now, where do we get this particular rule from? We get this rule from two maxims which are extremely important under the law of torts. The first maxim is called as injuria sine damno, and the second maxim is called as damnum sine injuria. Alright, so it's just flipping the words. Injuria refers to injury, legal injury. Sine means without, and damno or damnum means damages. So, injuria sine damnum refers to a situation where there is a legal injury without a damage, an actual damage. Whereas damnum sine injuria refers to a situation wherein there is an actual damage without a legal injury. Now, if you have listened to something that I just said before this, you might have guessed that injuria sine damnum shall be considered as actionable under torts, but damnum sine injuria will not be considered as actionable under torts. To give you an example of clarifying as to what exactly do we mean by injuria sine damnum and damnum sine injuria, I first want to talk about this case of Ashby versus White. The case of Ashby versus White will help us understand what exactly is the situation which is called as injuria sine damnum. Now, in case of Ashby versus White, the case that happened was the fact that there was an election officer who was in charge of conducting elections in a particular area. There was elections which were taking place for the purpose of electing their representatives of the people belonging in that area, and there was an election officer who was appointed in order to administer these elections in a proper manner. Now this election officer refused to take the vote of one particular person who was belonging to that particular community. So he rejected this person from casting his vote, or refused the person from registering or casting his vote. Now let's consider there were two candidates who were standing for the elections, candidate A and candidate B. The plaintiff in this situation, the person who was refused from casting the vote, he was going to vote for candidate A. Alright, and he was refused to cast his vote. But incidentally, even though the plaintiff did not cast his vote, candidate A itself won. So the candidate for whom the plaintiff wanted to vote, he was the candidate who won anyway, even without the vote of the plaintiff. Now this is a situation where there is no actual damage which is caused. Actual damage would be caused if candidate B would have won and the plaintiff could have said that if I would have registered my vote, maybe candidate A would have won. Alright, but in this situation there was no legal damage because of the fact that the candidate for whom the plaintiff wanted to vote, he won it anyway, he won the elections anyway. But here there is a legal injury in place because the legal right of a person to vote, every person has a legal right to vote in our country, in any country for that matter, any democratic country, and his legal right was infringed because of the action of the election officer. Because of which this action of refusal by the election officer, the refusal which was given to the plaintiff to cast his vote was considered to be actionable under tort because it was a situation where there was a legal injury although there was no actual damage. Alright, so that is why the case of Ashby versus White is very important for us to understand what exactly do we mean by injuria sine damnum. Now the next case that I am going to talk about is a case which is going to exemplify what exactly is the meaning of damnum sine injuria. The case is called as the Gloucester Grammar School case. Now in the Gloucester Grammar School case, there was a principal of a school who was running his school in a very successful manner. His school was very famous in the area in which the school used to function, and this gentleman came across another school being constructed right next to the principal's school. Now in this situation what happened was there were two schools, they were rival schools because both of them were providing more or less the same facilities, and now the principal school which was going in a very good manner, the plaintiff school which was going in a very good manner had to suffer some damages, monetary damages, because now the students in the locality who were going to register themselves in the school had two options. So that is why there was a division of students which took place between the plaintiff school and the new school which was constructed right next to the plaintiff school, because of which there was a monetary damage which was suffered by the principal. So the plaintiff, who was the principal of the former school, the original school, he essentially filed a case against the new principal of the new school, right? And his case was basically the fact that because of the action of the principal who constructed the new school, there was a legal damage which was caused to the former school's principal, alright, the original school's principal. Now in this case, the court recognized the fact that yes, there was actual damages. Damages is in existence because there was a monetary damage which was suffered by the principal of the original school. However, what the court held was that, or what the court identified was that there was no legal injury which was caused, in the sense that the new school was constructed by a person who was very well within his rights to construct the new school. There was no duty upon this person to not build this new school. There was no legal right in the hands of the plaintiff by which he could prevent this person from constructing the new school, because of which the construction of the new school and the starting of the new school was not at all against any person's legal right, or it was not against anyone's legal interest. It was not against the interest of any person, although it caused damage, which is why the court said that this is a classic situation of damnum sine injuria, wherein a damage is present but there is no legal injury coupled with that particular damage. And that is why in this situation the plaintiff was not allowed to hold an action against the defendant. Now the last constituent element while proving torts or an action under torts is basically legal remedy. Now legal remedy, for the purpose of talking about legal remedy, I would like to talk about this Latin phrase called as ubi jus ibi remedium. It basically means that wherever there is a right, there will be a remedy. So the entire concept of legal rights and legal duties is going to be useless if there is no remedy to protect the legal right and to admonish someone who is not fulfilling his legal duty, which is the reason why for every right which is in place, there will be a legal remedy in place, and this existence of the legal remedy is one of the constituent elements of tort. What exactly is a legal remedy is something that we are going to talk about in the later half of this lecture, because I have basically mentioned list of remedies which are available to go against the action of torts, but the fact remains that there will be a remedy because a tort is infringement of someone's legal right. So the person whose legal right is infringed shall definitely get a remedy to act against the person who has caused the infringement of legal right. Now the next thing that I am going to talk about is tortious liability. And this will be in consonance with what I have already talked about. So I have already talked about the constituent elements of tort. So the constituent elements of torts are required to prove that there is a tort in existence. What happens after that you have proved that a tort is in existence? There will be a liability which will be imposed upon the person who has committed the tort. This liability is called as tortious liability. What exactly is a liability? A liability is the state of being legally responsible for committing a wrong. So as we know that tort is a wrong, so whenever a tort is committed, the person has to be held liable for the tort which is committed, and being held liable essentially means making him responsible for the act that he has committed, the wrongful act that he has committed. So essentially the corollary to this statement is the fact that whenever there is a wrongful act which is committed, and whenever there is a damage caused because of this wrongful act, it will definitely lead to existence of a tortious liability, right? Now tortious liability is a state in which a person is legally held liable for committing a tort, something that we have already dealt with. Now again there comes a distinction between what happens in case of a tortious liability and what happens in case of a criminal liability. As I've already said that the law of torts and the law of crimes are very overlapping, in the sense that the action which qualifies to be a tort also qualifies to be a crime. In case of a criminal liability, that means a person being held responsible for the crime that he has committed. In case of a criminal liability, the rule is that there has to be presence of two things. First is mens rea, second is actus reus. Now this has already been taken in the second lecture in this lecture series itself when criminal law was talked about, but I will just brief you upon it. Mens rea basically means guilty mind. That means a person is not just acting in a wrongful manner, he also intends to act in that wrongful manner. Alright, actus reus means the wrongful action which is done. So in case of a criminal liability, you need to prove two things. The first thing is that you need to prove that there is an existence of a wrongful act which is committed by the person who is accused of committing the wrongful act. And the second thing that is essentially to be proven is that the person who has committed the wrongful act intended to commit that wrongful act as well. So there is the action coupled with intention to commit the wrongful act, which will lead to criminal liability. So what is the case with respect to torts? With respect to torts, a generalization cannot be made. So with respect to crimes, there can be a generalization which can be made that a crime will not lead to a criminal liability unless and until it has the constituent elements of actus reus and mens rea. In case of tortious liability, the first thing that you have to prove is the constituent elements of torts, that is, a tort has been committed by a person. The second thing that you have to prove is essentially the fact that the person may have intended to commit the wrong, that particular tort, or he may not have intended. Alright, and there is no general rule which says that you have to show intention or you do not have to show this intention, or it is called as a mental element. So mens rea is usually called as a mental element, wherein there is some objective, there is some malicious motive, or there is some bad faith in the action which is committed by the person. So that I am going to refer to it as mental element rather than talking specifically about intention. Intention will be a part of the mental element. So in case of torts, there is no generalization which can be made wherein we can conclude that for every tort to be proven, there has to be an existence of mental element. It happens to be so that in case of a tort, there are some torts in which mental element is necessary to be proven, whereas there are some torts in which the liability will automatically flow from the act which is committed without talking about the mental element at all. So to give you an example of a few torts wherein mental element is necessary to be proven, it basically is assault, a tort of assault, a tort of battery, a tort wherein you are deceiving someone. So basically these actions which will lead to an assault, which will lead to a battery, which will lead to a situation of deceit, which will lead to malicious prosecution or negligence for that matter, there has to be some intention, there has to be some mental element, not only intention. Now, there are various kinds of mental element. For example, there could be intention, there could be malice, there could be motive, a wrong motive to commit a particular act. All of these will be considered as mental elements. So that is the reason why in case of those torts such as assault, battery, deceit, negligence, malicious prosecution, you have to prove the existence of some mental element, that the person intended to do that particular wrong, or the person knew that damage will be caused but he still went ahead and did it anyway. Some mental element has to be proven. Alright, what exactly is the meaning of assault, battery? I am going to talk about. Deceit essentially refers to a fraudulent practice. For example, if I cheat someone with an intention of deceiving that person, that shall also be falling under the category of torts. Malicious prosecution means a situation where I am filing a case, a false case against someone, knowing that the case is false, but I am only doing it to trouble the other person. Because filing a case in the court of law will essentially mean the person having to visit the court of law multiple times, and going through the entire rigmarole of going through a trial. So it will lead to a lot of monetary loss as well as physical drain and mental drain, because of which this is called as malicious prosecution. And malicious prosecution essentially means you should know that it is false, but you should still go ahead and do it. In such a situation, that particular thing shall be considered as tort, and that will be considered as a tort only if you can prove that the mental element was present. If by mistake I file a case which I don't know is false, that will not fall under the category of malicious prosecution. Lastly, negligence will basically refer to a situation where there is a duty of care which has to be followed by a person, but it is not followed by the person. We will talk about negligence in depth when we talk about specific torts. But for now, I will give you an example of a case wherein the mental element was not considered to be essential. And the example is the case of National Coal Board versus J.E. Evans. Now, in this case, the defendant did not know. So, basically the defendant has some land, and underneath the land there was this underground electric wires which were going and which was basically supplying electricity to the whole area. So, these electric wires were passing through the land of the defendant. Now, the defendant was digging up his land for some purpose. It could be for the purpose of farming, or maybe he was building something, and while he was digging it up, he happened to cause damage to those electric wires. Alright, and this was considered to be a wrongful act on his part. It was basically claimed by the plaintiff that he has committed a wrongful act because he has damaged the electric wires, and the damage which was caused to the electric wires has led to further damage caused to the plaintiff. But in this situation, it was held that the person did not have knowledge about the fact that the electric wires were underneath the ground. In such a situation where there is an absence of knowledge in place, it cannot be said that he had the mental element to actually cause damage to the electric wires. And this was one of the cases in which mental element was considered not to be essential, was considered to be essential in order to prove that a particular action is a tort. And because the mental element was not there, the particular action was, that particular tort was not actionable. Now, to give you an example of those circumstances in which mental elements are not essential to prove a tort, it basically refers to three kinds of liabilities. The first one is vicarious liability, the second one is strict liability, and the third one is absolute liability. Now, vicarious liability basically refers to a situation in which a person is a master or the person is an employer, and he has employed a servant to do certain duties for him. Now, the servant has gone out, and in the process of doing his duty, he has committed some action of tort. He has committed a wrongful action, it has led to a legal damage to someone, and that person has sued the servant for the purpose of getting the remedy for the infringement of his legal right. Now, in this situation, vicarious liability says that the servant will not be responsible, but the master will be responsible, because the servant is acting on behalf of the master, which is why indirectly it will be the master who is responsible for the wrongful act of the servant, and the servant will not be responsible. Now, in this situation, the master cannot say that I did not have the mental element to commit the crime, to commit the tort, because I did not commit the tort in the first place. It was committed by the action of my servant. the master cannot take this defense because of the fact that vicarious liability requires no mental element to be present for the purpose of imposing this liability on the master. The second kind of liability wherein mental element is not essential is the strict liability. Now strict liability and absolute liability are more or less the same things. The only difference is that in case of strict liability there are certain defenses which are available in order to get away with the liability, but in case of absolute liability the liability is absolute. There cannot be any defense which can be taken by the defendant if absolute liability is proven against him. Now strict liability or absolute liability basically refers to a situation wherein it is stated that if a person is in possession of a particular thing in his property, and if the particular thing which is in his possession is of such a nature that there is a high tendency of it causing damage if it escapes from the possession of the person, either escapes from the property or escapes from the possession, then the damage which is caused because of this particular thing escaping from that person's possession shall impose an absolute liability or a strict liability upon the person. That means that even if the person did not intend to let that thing escape, or even if the person did not have any motive or any malice or any knowledge of the fact that the particular thing is going to be escaping his particular possession, then in that situation there will be an imposition of a strict liability or an absolute liability upon that person. So in such a situation, the person or the defendant who is accused of that particular action of causing damage because of the thing which has escaped from his possession, he cannot take the defense that I did not have the mental element to commit that particular act, or the legal injury was not caused because of a wrongful act or wrongful omission on my part. Because whenever there is a material which is extremely dangerous and which is in the possession of a person, that person has an absolute duty to make sure that the particular thing which has a tendency of causing damage if it escapes does not escape and cause damage to the others. So the classic example of strict liability or absolute liability is the case of Bhopal gas tragedy. So in Bhopal gas tragedy, the Union Carbide was a company which was basically again having a gas plant in Bhopal, and on one unfortunate day, this gas got leaked out of that particular premises, or the premises of that company. And because of this gas leak, there was immense damage which was caused to the people who were living around that particular premises. So in this situation, the Union Carbide as a company cannot take the defense that it did not have the knowledge, or it did not have the intention, or it did not have the malice to commit that particular legal injury, because in such a situation, because there is a dangerous product in picture, that is the gas which was leaked which caused the legal injury, and because this dangerous product was kept in possession of the company, the Union Carbide company, there was an absolute responsibility on Union Carbide to make sure that the gas leak does not happen. And the fact that it happened, the fact that the gas leaked out of the premises of Union Carbide company will lead to the assumption, or will lead to the conclusion, that there will be an imposition of absolute liability or strict liability upon such a person, when mental element, the intention to actually cause the damage, or the malice to cause the damage, or the motive behind causing that damage, is something which is not going to be looked at by the law in order to bring about an action of torts against such a person. Now that we have talked about the constituent elements of torts, and we have also covered what exactly do we mean by tortious liability and the existence of the mental element while proving whether or not a person is liable for the action of torts, we will now go on to talk about certain general defenses which are available for the defendant in an action for torts, wherein the defendant gets to prove his innocence by stating that his particular situation falls under one of the exceptions or one of the general defenses which are provided for under the law of torts. So now the entire purpose of having these general defenses in place is because of the fact that when a plaint is filed by a plaintiff in a court of law, the court will only get to know the side of the plaintiff. That is, only a one-sided argument is going to be proposed by the plaintiff. So for the court to get another aspect of what exactly happened, the court will have to give an opportunity to the defendant to come up with his own arguments, and one of the arguments that the defendant can come up with, the defendant has actually two options. The first option is clearly deny that he was not at all involved in the action which is complained against, or what the defendant can do is that he can accept that he was involved in the action, but he can say that the current circumstance or the current situation falls under one of the general defenses which are provided for under the law of torts. So now we are going to talk about which are these general defenses which can actually lead to the defendant getting scot-free out of that entire action of tort without having to undergo any liability. The first defense that we are going to talk about is something called as a defense of consent, which the Latin maxim for this particular defense is voluntas non fit injuria. It basically means that whenever a person has voluntarily agreed to suffer certain damages or suffer certain injury, he cannot go ahead and complain against the other person for causing that injury to him. Now, the best example to consider what exactly is voluntas non fit injuria is to talk about a wrestling match. Now, whenever a wrestling match is taking place, both the participants in the wrestling match are involved in physical combat, wherein it is very likely that one of them will be hurt. That is, a tort of battery can take place. Now, in this situation, the person who is severely hurt or gravely hurt, the question is, can he bring about an action of tort against the other participant in the wrestling match? And the answer to that is no, he cannot. And the reason behind the answer is the fact that he has consented to engage in that particular activity. He has consented to involve in this physical combat sport that he is playing. And because of the consent that he has given, he cannot go back on his consent and he cannot claim damages from the other person who has caused that injury to him. Now, in case of voluntas non fit injuria, there are two essential elements which have to be fulfilled. That is, the defendant has to prove the existence of these two elements. The first one is the fact that the defendant has the knowledge of the risk, and the second one is the plaintiff has the knowledge of the risk, and the second one is consent is given for accepting this particular risk. Now, in one of the cases which was named Hall versus Brooklands Auto Racing Company, there was a plaintiff who was a spectator in a motor car race. So, there was a motor car race which was taking place and the plaintiff was essentially a spectator, and he was sitting amongst the crowds in the stands watching that particular motor car race. Now, in one such incident, what happened was, when the motor car was taking its laps, there was a collision which happened between two motor cars, and in this collision, one of the motor car parts flew and it landed in the crowd. Now, this motor car part essentially hit the plaintiff and the plaintiff suffered injury, and the plaintiff sued the entire racing club, that is the Brooklands Auto Racing Club, stating that there was a tort which was committed because there was a wrongful act, there was a legal injury, and that is why he wanted a remedy for it. Now, the defendant, that is the racing club, essentially took the defense of the fact that the plaintiff came to the racing hall and he was watching that motor car race essentially means that he has consented to any harm which might be caused in such a situation, such as the motor cars colliding and one of the spare parts flying in the crowd and hitting the plaintiff. And this was agreed by the court, where the court held that yes, this is very much a situation which falls under the defense of voluntas non fit injuria, where the plaintiff has given his consent to the risk that he might get hurt because of the activity that he is engaging in. Now, there are two things which are absolutely important in case of voluntas non fit injuria. The first one is the fact that the consent which is given for the risk which the plaintiff is undertaking, this particular consent has to be free consent. So, it should not happen that the person or the plaintiff is under a threat or under a compulsion to give that particular consent. Alright, so it is necessary, the first thing that you have to check when the defense of voluntas non fit injuria is pleaded, the first thing that has to be checked is whether the defendant has, whether the plaintiff has truly given consent to the particular risk and whether that consent is absolutely free. That is, it should not be vitiated by fraud or compulsion or undue influence or a mistake for that matter. The other thing which is very important in case of voluntas non fit injuria is the fact that the act which has been committed, that is the injury which has been caused, should be the exact thing for which the consent should have been given. And to explain this, the best example is this case of Lakshmi Rajan versus Malar Hospital Limited, wherein there was a woman who was suffering from breast cancer, and she underwent a surgery for the purpose of removing this cancer. Now, when the doctor was conducting the surgery on this woman, the doctor removed the woman's uterus without any justification. And when the woman sued the doctor on the ground that the consent was given for the purpose of the cancer treatment and not for the purpose of removal of uterus, the doctor said that this is a case of voluntary non-fit injuria, wherein the plaintiff had given her consent to undergo the risk which is involved in case of surgery. However, in this case, the court held that the risk which was undertaken by the plaintiff, or the risk for which consent was given by the plaintiff, was the risk relating to surgery in order to remove the breast cancer. But in the current situation, the circumstances are such that the removal of uterus is being complained against, and that was something for which the consent was not given, and this is the reason why in this case voluntary non-fit injuria was not considered to be a valid defense for the defendant to escape his liability. Now, having talked about voluntary non-fit injuria, the next important defense is a situation where the plaintiff himself is a wrongdoer, and for this defense the Latin maxim is ex turpi causa non oritur action, and it basically means that for a dishonorable man, you cannot let this dishonorable man come up with an action for torts. Alright. Now, the fact that the plaintiff itself is a wrongdoer essentially leads to the conclusion that no one owes a duty of care towards that particular plaintiff. So, in this case of Ashton versus Turner, the plaintiff and the defendant had committed a crime of burglary, and they were essentially fleeing from the crime scene. Now, they were fleeing in a car, and the defendant was the one who was driving the car. The defendant was under the influence of alcohol, and he was driving in a very negligent manner. Now, in this situation, the law, what this entire defense tries to tell us is that the law will not take into consideration the duty of care which is owed to each other by two wrongdoers. Right. So, they are essentially saying that if the plaintiff is a wrongdoer, even if the wrong is completely disconnected from the tort which is committed, the action for tort will not arise, because the defendant can simply take the defense that the plaintiff itself is a wrongdoer, or the plaintiff is also a wrongdoer. Alright. So, that was what was held in the case of Ashton versus Turner. Now, the third exception is inevitable accident. Now, it basically refers to a situation where there is an accident which has been caused, and this accident is inevitable. That means no amount of reasonable care would have avoided this particular accident. Now, to explain this, I want to talk about the case of Sridhar Tiwari versus UP SRTC. Now, in this situation, there was a bus which belonged to the UP SRTC, that is Uttar Pradesh State Transport Corporation, wherein the bus was going on a road on a small road in a village, and suddenly a cyclist came in front of the bus. Now, another fact which has to be noticed in this case is the fact that it was raining in the particular area where this incident took place, and the roads were wet. Obviously, when the cyclist came in front of the bus driver tried to put on his sudden brakes, and because of the sudden brakes, the bus basically skid on the roads because of the fact that the roads were wet, and the bus hit another bus, and basically there was damage which was caused because of the entire skidding. Now, this was basically complained against. An action for tort was brought against the driver of the bus who applied the sudden brakes and caused the damage to the other bus. However, the court held in this case that the driver did everything within his control to exercise reasonable care. It was identified that the bus was not driving on an exceptionally high speed. It was very much a moderate speed in which the bus driver was driving the bus, in which situation it was considered that this was a case of an inevitable accident. Another example to talk about inevitable accident could be there was this one case in which a person was riding a horse on the road, and there was a stray dog which suddenly started barking at the horse. Now, the horse got very scared of the dog's barking, and he went a little berserk, and he caused damage to the people who were walking on the road because he started running around and he started jumping and all. Now, in this situation, once again, it was held by the court that the fact that the dog would bark and this would startle the horse was something which was not at all foreseeable, was something which could not have been avoided by any amount of reasonable care, and that is why in this case as well, the owner of the horse was not considered to be liable for the damage which was caused by the horse, because it was considered to be a case of inevitable accident. The next exception is act of God, or it is also called as force majeure. Now, act of God is very similar to an inevitable accident. However, in an inevitable accident, the human being plays an active role in the accident. But in case of an act of God situation, the entire damage is caused not at all by the interference of the human being, but because of an act of God. Now, what do I mean by an act of God? It essentially refers to forces of nature. So, whatever damage is caused by the forces of nature shall be considered as falling under this particular exception. Now, for example, a damage which is caused due to flood or earthquake or very high rainfall, sudden high rainfall, which was not at all expected. All of this will fall under this particular exception. To exemplify this, in the case of Nicholas versus Marshland, the defendant basically had created lakes, artificial lakes in his own land. And how did he do it? There was a stream which was near his land. He basically built dams on the streams in such a way that the artificial lakes were created in his own land. Now, this was going on very properly for a long period of time. However, once there was an extraordinarily heavy rainfall which took place, because of which the embankments of the lake, probably some artificial wall which was created for the purpose of making the lake so that the water remains in the lake, that particular artificial embankment or the wall gave away, and the water from the lake essentially flooded the neighbor's land. And the neighbor was basically growing crops in his land, and those crops were washed away because of the sudden inflow of water. Now, in this situation, once again, the defense of act of God was taken by the defendant, and the court agreed to this when the court said that this is truly a case of act of God, because the extraordinarily heavy rainfall was not something which could have been foreseeable, and no amount of reasonable care could have avoided this particular incident. And obviously it was also the natural forces which had caused the damage, and it was not really the fault of the plaintiff. So this was also something that was, the defendant. This was also something which was held, and this is exactly the exception or the defense of act of God. Now, the next defense which is in place is the defense of necessity. This means that whenever I am committing a particular action, or I am failing to commit a particular action, that is an act or an omission, which is performed, which completely qualifies as a tort, alright, but the act or the omission is done for the purpose of preventing some bigger harm, that is, there is a necessity to do that to commit that particular tort in order to prevent something else which is a bigger harm from taking place. For example, suppose there is a person A and he sees a house burning. Alright, there is a fire which is there in the house, and the house is burning, and it is very much possible that the houses next to this burning house, the fire will spread immediately to those houses, and those houses will also suffer. So what A does is that A breaks in the house, he basically trespasses in the house, which is a tort, and he tries to contain the fire from spreading. Now, in this situation, obviously A has committed the tort of trespass. It is clear, there is no two explanation with respect to that. However, in the current situation, the reason why he committed that tort was in order to prevent a greater harm. So the commission of the tort became a necessity, and that is the reason why in this particular situation, A will not be held liable for the tort of trespass, because he had committed the action in case of a necessity or an emergency situation. The next defense that we are going to talk about is the defense of private defense. Alright, and private defense is something that we have to pay a little attention here. Alright, it basically says that suppose there is an imminent threat to my body or my property, or the body of property or property of someone who is very close to me. That means if someone is threatening to cause harm to myself, that is my body or my property, or someone who is close to me, their body or their property, in that situation, I have a right to retaliate or to revert back, even if my retaliation will lead to a tort. This is exactly the exception of, or the defense of private defense. However, there are two important elements in case of private defense. The first element is that the person who is taking the plea of private defense, there should have been an imminent threat to the body or property of that person. Second of all, the force which is used in order to do away with this threat should be proportionate in nature. Alright, so there should be proportionate force which is used in order to tackle this imminent threat that is posed towards my body or my property. Now the example of this proportionate force would be, suppose there is a situation wherein there is a thief who enters a person's house, and the thief has basically entered in order to steal something from the house. Now in this situation, suppose the owner of the house shoots the thief in his head. Alright. In this situation, obviously once again the tort of wrongful death has been committed by the owner of the house, and the owner of the house takes the defense of private defense. He says that there was an imminent threat to my property, the thief had entered my house for the purpose of stealing, and I took retaliatory measures, and by way of this retaliatory measure it caused his wrongful death. This could be very well be a defense. However, in the court of law this may not work, because if the thief had come inside the house only to steal something, then there were many other ways to prevent the thief from doing that particular act. For example, a stick could have been used to beat up the thief, or the gun could be used in order to shoot the thief on his leg. There was no need to shoot the thief on his head, which led to his fatality. And this is the basis, or this is the reason why it is very necessary that whenever you are pleading the defense of private defense, you need to show that the retaliatory measure that you have taken in order to protect yourself or your property is proportionate to the threat which was posed towards your body or your property. The next exception and the last exception in the last general defense in the list of general defenses for torts is the statutory authority. Now consider a situation where a person is entering my house and he is committing a search of my house. He is searching for a particular thing inside my house. This is very well a case of trespass, wherein without my permission a person has entered my property and he is moving around the property and he is basically disrupting the property because he is searching for something. However, on the other hand, consider a situation that this exact action is done by a police officer. Now in the former situation where the person who has entered into my house and is conducting a search of my house is a random person, it will definitely lead to an action of tort and the defendant will be held liable in this case. But because of the fact that in the second situation the police officer is the one who is committing that particular act of entering into my house and searching searching for something inside my house, it gives the police officer a statutory authority. This police officer is entering my house on the basis of a statutory authority which is held by him, and that is the reason why in the second situation the tort will not be committed. The police officer can take the defense of the fact that he has the statutory authority to do the exact thing which is complained of as a tort by the plaintiff. With this we are done with the general defenses. So basically these 7 general defenses are available for the defendant to prove that although he has committed the act which is complained about, he has not committed a tort per se because his situation falls under any of these general defenses. Now after this, let's move on to talk about some specific torts. Alright. Now when in earlier I talked about the common elements of tort, I was essentially talking about any tort. For the purpose of proving any tort, you have to prove these 3 common constituent elements. The first one being that there should be a wrongful act or an omission. The second one being that it should lead to a legal injury, and the third one being that there should be a legal remedy to correct the injury which has been caused. Now apart from these general constituent elements of torts, there are certain specific torts in place as well, such as the tort of negligence or the tort of nuisance or the tort of trespass. And in case of these specific torts, there are certain additional constituent elements which might have to be proved by the plaintiff in order to bring about an action against the defendant. So these specific torts, I am basically going to deal only with 3 specific torts today. There are many other specific torts which I am not going to talk about because they are very specific in nature and they are not as widely accepted or as widely, the rights which with respect to those torts are not as widely exercised as in these 3 specific tort cases. The first specific tort that we are going to talk about is the tort of negligence. Now, what exactly is the meaning of negligence? If I talk about it from a layman's point of view, negligence is carelessness. Alright. So, whenever there is an injury which is caused because of someone's carelessness, you can say that the person is guilty of committing the tort of negligence. In the legal terms, negligence can be considered to be a situation wherein there is a person who has the responsibility of exercising a certain standard of care. Alright, so there is an expectation that a certain standard of care will be undertaken by the doer of that particular tort or by a reasonable man. Alright, so if in a particular situation, although you cannot say that the doer is the one who is supposed to undertake that standard of care, if you talk about it from a reasonable man's point of view as well, it is okay. So it is basically a standard of care which has to be undertaken by the doer or a reasonable man, and the negligence is caused when the standard of care is not complied with, or when the standard of care is not exercised by the defendant. Now, Donoghue versus Stevenson is the most famous case under tort law. It is also called as snail in a bottle case. Alright, the facts of the case are basically that the plaintiff had purchased a bottle of ginger beer, and this bottle of ginger beer he had purchased for his lady friend. Now, the person for whom the bottle of ginger beer was bought essentially poured the contents of the ginger beer in a tumbler, and she drank the contents. Alright. Now, there was still some contents in the bottle which were left, and when she poured the rest of the contents, she realized that a dead snail is found in the remainder of the contents. So that is why basically the plaintiff found a dead snail in a can of ginger beer, a sealed can of ginger beer. Now, in this particular situation, the plaintiff basically alleged that it has led to certain health problems for her, and she has suffered in her health as a consequence of drinking this ginger beer which had a dead snail floating in it. Now, one of the defenses which was pleaded in case of Donoghue versus Stevenson was the fact that the manufacturing company, now once again to clarify a little bit, the plaintiff brought the action against the manufacturer of ginger beer, alright, not on the person who was selling the ginger beer, that is the retailer. They did not bring about an action against the retailer, they brought about an action against the manufacturer of ginger beer. Now, in this situation, the court basically held, now one of the defenses which was taken by the defendant was that he did not owe a duty of care towards the plaintiff. Alright, and in this situation the court held that the defendant was the manufacturer of the ginger beer, and obviously the defendant owed a duty of care towards his consumer. So the court basically held that the only reason why you are manufacturing the ginger beer is in order for the consumer to consume it. So it is an obvious corollary to this argument that there is a duty, a legal duty which is owed by the defendant to the plaintiff, the manufacturer to the consumer, and what is the legal duty? To take care that the bottle does not contain any noxious material. So this dead snail was considered to be a noxious material or a harmful material, and the entire duty on the defendant or the manufacturer was to ensure that he has to take care that nothing noxious is present in the bottle of ginger beer. And this is the reason why it was considered that there was a legal duty on the manufacturer. This legal duty was not followed, therefore there was a breach of this legal duty, and it obviously led to health damages which were caused to the plaintiff. Right? Now we go on to the next specific tort, that is a tort of nuisance. Now, nuisance essentially refers to a tort which is an unlawful interference with a person's right to enjoy his particular property or a land. Alright. So, what do you mean by interference with the right of enjoyment of the land? Alright. So, the examples of nuisance could be in the form of noise. So, if there is excessive noise which is made by my neighbor, it will affect my right of enjoyment of my land or my flat for that matter in the current circumstances, since we are all living in flats mostly. And in such circumstances, I have a right to take an action against my neighbor because my neighbor has committed an action, has committed a tort of nuisance. Because of his loud noise that he is playing in his own property, he is interfering with my right of enjoying my own property in a peaceful manner. So usually loud noises or excess heat or smoke coming out from my neighbor's building or from any adjacent building or any adjacent land, or some noxious smell which is coming from an adjacent land, or fumes which are emanating from a particular property, all of this will be considered as classic examples of nuisance, wherein because of something that is happening in the other person's land, my right of enjoying my property in peace is affected. For making an act of nuisance, once again, the constituent elements for proving nuisance is, first of all, there has to be a wrongful act on the part of the defendant. The defendant should be actively involved in doing some wrongful act. That means he should be playing loud music, or he should be burning something in his own house, or he should be heating something which is actually causing a lot of heat to enter my house. Something has to be done, an active role has to be played by the defendant. And second of all, this action which is committed by the defendant should lead to a wrong or a loss or a damage to be caused to the plaintiff, that is me. Now, for example, suppose A and B are neighbors. Usually, nuisance is committed by a person who lives next to you or is standing next to you, or basically there is some kind of connection, the physical connection which is between the plaintiff and the defendant in case of a tort of nuisance. Not necessarily, but in most circumstances. So suppose there is A and B, and these A and B are two people who are neighbors, and B has a sari mill. He has an entire functioning sari mill in his apartment, and they are neighbors. Now the sari mill, when the mill is functioning, it creates a loud noise when it functions, and the noise is so loud that it makes the floor of the neighbor vibrate. Now in this circumstance, as B's neighbor who is running a sari mill, A is the one who is affected because his right of peaceful enjoyment of his own property, that is his own flat, is not being able to be exercised by him because of first of all the noise, and second of all the vibration of the floor. And this is the reason why this will fall under the tort of nuisance. Now nuisance is of two kinds. One is public nuisance, the other one is private nuisance. Public nuisance is a situation in which there is an interference with the right of enjoyment of the property, and this right belongs to the public in general. It's not a personal right, it is a public right, and this public right is being infringed by the act of someone else. For example, obstructing a public way shall be considered as a classic example of public nuisance. That means, suppose there is a public way, there is a lane which is used by the public in general, and suppose tomorrow I park my car exactly perpendicular to that particular lane. It will essentially obstruct the way of the people, and this will definitely lead to causing public nuisance. Now the point with public nuisance is that, and it is very important to note, that public nuisance is not usually actionable under the civil action of torts. Public nuisance is usually actionable as a crime and not as a tort. Why is the reason for that? Because public nuisance is affecting the rights of a lot of people, because as I told you, it is affecting the peaceful enjoyment of a particular land or a particular property, and this particular right of peaceful enjoyment belongs to many number of people. So that is why public nuisance is a circumstance in which all these people's rights are getting affected, because of which if you allow the action of tort to take place, there are going to be multiple cases filed by multiple people against the same person who is committing the act of public nuisance. And then it is going to completely take away the essence of having this action of tort in place, because if too many people are asking for monetary compensation from one person who has committed the crime of public the tort of public nuisance, then essentially their actions are not going to be successful, because this one person is not going to be in a position to pay compensation to all of them. So that is the reason why in most of the circumstances public nuisance is considered to be a crime and not a tort. However, there are certain exceptional circumstances wherein if the person who is filing the plaint and claiming that the other person has engaged in nuisance, when the nuisance is with respect to an action which is technically causing public nuisance, but if the plaintiff is able to prove that there is a specific damage which is caused to the plaintiff, in addition to the public nuisance, there is a specific damage which is caused to the plaintiff. If this can be proved by the plaintiff, then even in case of a public nuisance, a private action of tort can be brought against the perpetrator. For example, suppose there is a way which is being, there is a lane which is being used by the public in general. The public have a right of peaceful enjoyment of this particular lane, that is for the purpose of passing, and I dig a trench in this particular lane. Now the digging of the trench is causing an act of public nuisance. It is going to affect the rights of multiple people. So that is why technically this act of me digging a trench in the middle of the road is going to be a circumstance of public nuisance. However, if a person falls in this trench, this particular person has been affected personally because of my action. So in addition to the trench being an object of public nuisance, it has also additionally become an object of private nuisance, because a particular person has fallen inside the trench and suffered personal injury. In this situation, the person who has fallen in the trench can very well proceed against me and claim that I have committed a tort of nuisance, even though the act which is committed by me technically falls under the category of public nuisance. The second kind of nuisance is private nuisance. Private nuisance, as you must have guessed by now based on my definition of public nuisance, private nuisance is a situation wherein a particular action is infringing a particular individual's right of peaceful enjoyment of his property. Now, there is one very famous case in torts which talks about private nuisance, which is called as Hollywood Silver Fox Farm versus Emmett. Now, in the case of Hollywood Silver Fox Farm versus Emmett, the plaintiff had the business of breeding silver foxes. So, there was this particular breed of silver foxes, and the plaintiff was essentially involved in the business of breeding these silver foxes. Now, the female belonging to this particular breed of foxes, that is the vixens, who were silver foxes, silver vixens, if we may call them. These vixens were particularly sensitive towards loud noises, in the sense that if there is a loud noise which is caused during the breeding period of these vixens, the vixens become very aggressive and they may refuse to breed, or it may lead, the loud noise may lead to miscarriage of the vixen, or sometimes the vixens may even kill their own young ones. So that is why they are very volatile in nature during the breeding period. So that is why loud noises should completely be avoided. Now, in this case, the defendant basically fired shots from his loaded gun. Now, although the shots were shot from his own land, the place where he fired the shots was very close, as close as possible to the plaintiff's land. So that means there was some ill motive on the part of this person to cause harm to the plaintiff's silver fox business. And because of that loud noise, obviously the vixen suffered some damage, and obviously that led to the damage to the breeding business of the plaintiff as well. Now, in this particular situation, the court properly held that this was a classic case of private nuisance, because the defendant was entitled to shoot that particular shot in his own field, but it affected my peaceful enjoyment of the property wherein I was conducting my business of breeding silver foxes. So, this is the reason why the defendant was considered to be guilty of committing a tort of private nuisance. The next kind of specific tort is the tort of trespass. Now, in case of trespass, the situation that happens is that it is unlawful act which is committed on the property or the person or any other right of the person. So, now usually it is considered that trespass is only with respect to property. However, that is not the case in all circumstances. There are certain circumstances in which trespass can take place against the person, that is the body of the person, and sometimes even against the other rights that the person holds. For example, the right of reputation or any other right which the person holds. So, in this circumstance, trespass could be considered as a tort which is against the person or the property of an individual. So, we are going to talk about two kinds of trespass. One is trespass against person, other one is trespass against property. Now, trespass against person is essentially a situation in which there is a tort which is committed and it is an unreasonable interference. Okay, again very similar to nuisance, okay, but nuisance was unreasonable interference with the enjoyment of the property. Trespass is unreasonable interference very well, but it is unreasonable interference either with the body of the person or with the property of the person. So that is why whenever there is a trespass against the body of the person, it is essentially in a way wherein a person is causing actual harm to the person, that is bodily harm to the person. So, all the examples of trespass to person will include assault, battery, and last one is false imprisonment. Alright, all these three are the cases of trespass against person. Trespass against person means unreasonable interference or unjustified interference with the body of a person. It is different from nuisance, because in nuisance also they talk about unreasonable interference, but they talk about unreasonable interference with the right of enjoyment of the person over his property. So, now to talk about the three kinds of specific trespass against persons, the first one that we are going to talk about is battery. Now, battery basically refers to a situation wherein it is an intentional application of force by a person. So, a person is intentionally applying force to the person of another, that means to the body of another, without any lawful justification. Alright, so actually causing bodily injury or bodily harm to another person by intentional use of force without any justification. Alright, that is essentially the meaning of the term battery. For example, A hits B intentionally because of a personal grudge. This is a classic example of battery. Alright, so essentially battery refers to a situation wherein a person has intentionally used force. The force is used against the person of another individual, that is a body of another individual, and it is used, the force is used for absolutely no reason. It is absolutely unjustifiable. Now, and the example for this is A hits B because of a personal grudge. So, a personal grudge is definitely not a justification for interfering with the body of another person, and that is why this falls perfectly under the category of trespass to person. That is battery, the specific tort of battery. The second specific tort under trespass to person that we are going to talk about is the tort of assault. Now, in assault, there is a difference between battery and assault, and there might be a confusion in your minds as to what is the difference between battery and assault. Assault essentially refers to a situation which is the act which is committed just before the act of battery is committed. That means when a person is doing some act which is causing a reasonable apprehension in the mind of the plaintiff that he will be inflicted an injury will be inflicted upon him. This is a circumstance in which the tort of assault will take place. So, battery is actually inflicting harm, and assault is a reasonable apprehension that the other person will inflict harm upon me. That is essentially a classic case of assault. So, assault is the action which takes place just before actual battery takes place. So, assault may or may not lead to an actual battery, but it is the step which immediately precedes a battery. Alright. So, that is the reason why a battery is the actual infliction of the harm upon the body of a person, and assault is a reasonable apprehension in the mind of the plaintiff. You are doing a particular act which is creating a reasonable apprehension. The plaintiff is scared because he thinks that there will be a harm which will be caused to his body. Now, the wrong consists of an attempt to do a harm rather than actually committing a harm. So, battery essentially talks about a situation wherein an actual harm is inflicted upon the body of a person, but in case of an assault, it is an attempt to do that particular thing. Now, for this, the case of R versus George is important, in which the court basically talked about whether it will be a tort of assault if a gun is pointed to the head of the plaintiff. Alright, so in one particular circumstance, there was a loaded gun which was pointed at the head of the plaintiff, and the question was whether this particular act will be considered as an assault. And the court very well mentioned that whenever a loaded gun is pointed to the head of the another person, it will be considered as an assault. And suppose there is a circumstance where the gun is not loaded, it is an unloaded gun. Even in that circumstance, it will lead to an assault, because the plaintiff will have a reasonable apprehension that if there is a gun which is pointed to my head, irrespective of whether or not the plaintiff knows that the gun is loaded, he need not know it. The first thing that is going to come to his mind is a reasonable apprehension that he is going to be inflicted with an injury. But another circumstance exists where if the person knows that the gun is not loaded, then assault is not committed. Alright, so three circumstances talked about in the case of R versus George. The first circumstance is loaded gun pointed to the forehead of a person, definitely assault. Unloaded gun pointed to the head of a person where the plaintiff does not know that the gun is unloaded, basically is still an assault. Thirdly, unloaded gun pointed to the head of a person where the plaintiff knows that it is unloaded, that is, it is not a loaded gun, then in that situation it is not an assault. The last kind of trespass against person that we are going to talk about is false imprisonment. In case of false imprisonment, it basically consists of the imposition of a total restraint on a person's movement for a certain period of time. So, false imprisonment essentially talks about a situation wherein a person's movement is restricted because of the action of someone else. So, it basically goes against the liberty of a person, where a person has a liberty to move anywhere, and this liberty of a person is restricted because of someone else's act. The example for false imprisonment could be if A threatens B, and please remember that there is no need to actively restrain a person from moving. Even threatening a person by causing some injury if he moves from one place to another will also be considered as false imprisonment. So in the example that I am going to talk about, A is threatening B that if B leaves the house, A will kill B's family. Alright. In this situation, B is prevented from moving outside his house, not because A is actively restraining B, but because of a threat which is given to B that if he moves out of the house, then his family will be killed. This is also an example of false imprisonment. So two cases in which false imprisonment will happen. First of all, actively restraining a person from moving from one place to another or moving out of one place for that matter. And second one is not actively restricting but indirectly restricting a person from moving out of a particular place, which is the example that I talked about. Lastly, we are going to talk about trespass against property. Now, trespass against property again is the same as trespass against body, except that an unreasonable or unjustified interference is exercised against the property of a person. This basically refers to a situation wherein a person is either himself entering someone else's property or someone else's land, or he is doing it by some other means such as throwing stones. So even throwing stones into someone else's property when it is uninvited, when it is unjustified, will lead to a trespass against property. For example, and this example is for something that you guys have to think about, it basically means trespass against property means that someone is not invited in the property but that person is entering into that other person's property. So the question is, suppose A has invited B into his house and he has basically escorted B into the living room. B's action of entering in A's bedroom without A's permission, whether that will be considered as trespass against property as well, because technically the A has only invited B to bring himself to the living room and not in the bedroom. So the question is, will B's interference in the bedroom will also be considered as trespass, or whether that will be considered as something which is a part of the invitation inside the house? And the answer to this is that if these rooms are clearly bifurcated, that means if the living room is bifurcated, if the bedroom is bifurcated, then in that situation, when B is escorted into the living room by A, B is technically not supposed to enter the bedroom. That means B does not have the authorization to enter the bedroom. So in such a circumstance, if B enters the bedroom of A, it will be considered as trespass against A's property, and an action of tort will lie against B. With this, we are done with the second part of the lecture, and the last part is essentially a very small part which only deals with remedies which the person can rely upon for the purpose of bringing about an action of tort against another person. Now, having talked about the specific torts and also the general defenses which can be relied upon by the defendant while placing a defense with respect to the tort that he has been accused of, we have to talk about what exactly will be the consequence of an action of tort. So let's assume a situation wherein the constituent elements of tort have been fulfilled and a tort has been established, a tortious liability has been imposed upon the defendant as well, and the entire suit has come to a stage where the remedy is supposed to be given to the plaintiff, because we are assuming that the defendant is guilty of committing the tort that he is accused of. In such a circumstance, there are certain remedies which are available with the plaintiff, which the plaintiff can seek in order to compensate the loss that is caused to him and in order to punish the wrongdoer, that is the defendant, in the current situation. So there are two kinds of remedies in general. The first one is judicial remedies and the other one is extrajudicial remedies. In today's lecture, we are only concerned with the judicial remedies in place. Alright. So there are three kinds of judicial remedies which are available for an action of tort which is taken against a defendant. The first one is in the form of damages, the second one is in the form of injunction, and the third one is in the form of special restitution. So when we come to damages, damages is basically the compensation which is paid to the plaintiff for there are two purposes. First of all, either compensating the loss which has been caused to the plaintiff, and second of all, for punishing the defendant for committing that wrongful act in the first place. So when we talk about damages, we are essentially talking about pecuniary compensation or monetary compensation which the defendant will be asked to pay to the plaintiff for the wrong that has been committed against the plaintiff's legal right. So in this situation, after it is proved, the remedy part will come after it is proved that the tort has been committed by the defendant in the first place, and after this particular thing has been proved that the defendant is the one who has committed the wrong which he has been accused of, he shall be asked to pay pecuniary or monetary compensation to the plaintiff. Now there are various kinds of damages which can be awarded by a court of law. We are going to deal with three kinds of damages which are majorly the damages which are awarded by the court of law. The first one is ordinary damages, the second one is special damages, and the third one is aggravated damages. Now the first one is the ordinary damages. Ordinary damages basically refer to a situation wherein the court of law is going to calculate the loss which is caused to the plaintiff because of the defendant's wrongful act, and then the amount of loss which is caused to the plaintiff shall be compensated to the plaintiff by making the defendant pay that particular amount of compensation. In case of ordinary damages, the major purpose of awarding such kind of damages is basically to ensure that the plaintiff does not suffer any loss, or the plaintiff is put in a position in which he was before the loss was caused to him, at least monetarily or pecuniarily. So this is the reason why ordinary damages are also called as compensatory damages, and these damages are not really awarded to punish the defendant, but it is awarded in order to compensate the plaintiff for the loss which has been caused to the plaintiff. The second kind of damages are essentially special damages or exemplary damages. Exemplary damages are the damages which are awarded, which are the meaning of those damages is exactly opposite to ordinary damages. So as I told you, ordinary damages is not for the purpose of punishing the defendant, but in fact to compensate the plaintiff for the loss that has been caused to the plaintiff because of the defendant's wrongful act. In case of exemplary damages, on the other hand, the compensation is awarded not to compensate the plaintiff for the loss, but in fact to punish the defendant for the wrong that has been caused by him. So this is the reason why exemplary damages are in the nature of deterrence, in the sense that they deter future defendants from committing similar acts, because you are imposing exemplary damages, that is extraordinary damages on the current defendant in order to punish him for the wrong which has been committed by him. Whereas on the other hand, ordinary damages are obviously different, because ordinary damages only aim to compensate the plaintiff and not do anything further. The third kind of damages that we are going to talk about is aggravated damages. Now, as I told you that in case of ordinary damages, the court is essentially going to try to identify what is the loss which is caused to the plaintiff in monetary terms, and then the compensation equivalent to that loss will be asked to be paid by the defendant. In case of aggravated damages, it is more or less the same idea, in the sense that the loss will be calculated, the loss of the plaintiff will be calculated, and the defendant will be asked to pay the amount of compensation which is equivalent to the amount of the loss. However, in case of aggravated damages, the loss that is going to be detected monetarily is going to not be the monetary loss itself, but it is going to be the loss which cannot be determined easily in the monetary terms. For example, the loss of self-esteem. Now, loss of self-esteem is something which cannot really be calculated monetarily. Similarly, pain or agony which is caused to a person because of the defendant's wrongful act, even that will fall under the category of those damages which will be awarded for the purpose of compensating the plaintiff for such losses. Those losses which technically cannot be calculated in a monetary manner. However, there will be an attempt which is made to still attach some kind of monetary value to the loss which has been caused to the plaintiff, although the loss is something which is very personal and which is not at all capable of being calculated in monetary terms. There is going to be some monetary value attached to that particular loss, and then that particular monetary value will have to be paid by the defendant to the plaintiff in the form of compensation or in the form of damages. Such damages are called as aggravated damages. Now, the next kind of remedy that we are going to talk about, which can be awarded in case of an action of tort which is taken against the defendant, is a remedy of injunction. Now, an injunction is a situation in which there is absolutely no compensation in place. It is not at all a monetary remedy or a pecuniary remedy, but injunction is a situation wherein the court directs the defendant to stop him from doing a particular act or to restrain him from committing or continuing a particular act. So injunction is basically a situation wherein a person is stopped from doing something, and whenever the remedy of injunction is allowed in a torts case, it is essentially stopping the defendant from committing the act or continuing the act, stopping or restraining the defendant. Now an example of injunction, now why do we need injunction in the first place in case of law of torts, or why do we need injunction as a remedy at all when we have the remedy of a compensation or a pecuniary damages? The reason behind that is that consider the specific tort of nuisance. Basically, I am living in a flat. Every day at night after 12 o'clock, my neighbor plays loud music in his house, because of which I cannot sleep in my own flat. So it is basically interfering with my right of enjoyment of my property, which is a nuisance. Now in this situation, suppose I take an action against my neighbor, he is the defendant, I am the plaintiff. I have successfully proven that he is responsible for committing the tort of nuisance, and I go ahead and ask for remedy. In this situation, compensation by the neighbor is not really going to help my case. What is going to help my case is when the court asks the neighbor to stop doing that particular act which is causing the nuisance in the first place. And this is the reason why you need injunction as a remedy in case of a tort action in torts, because of the fact that injunction, there are certain torts in which compensation will not truly help the plaintiff achieve the purpose of filing the suit in the first case, and injunction is going to have to resort it to. The last remedy that we are going to talk about under an action of tort is the remedy of specific restitution. Now restitution essentially means returning something which has been acquired by a person. So when the plaintiff has been wrongfully dispossessed of his movable or immovable property, the court may order the specific property to be restored back to the plaintiff. So restitution, also known as restoration, it essentially means that something is taken away from the plaintiff, and the plaintiff, this particular thing has been complained against, that is the plaintiff is claiming that the defendant is the one who has unjustifiably taken away that particular movable or immovable thing from the possession of the plaintiff, and the plaintiff wants back that particular thing. Again, in this circumstance, compensation or injunction is not really going to be an appropriate remedy, because the entire purpose behind the plaintiff filing that suit of tort in the first place is in order to get himself back that property which has been taken away from him. So that is why restitution is necessary under such circumstances, and this is the reason why restitution is also a remedy which is available in case of an action of tort. Restitution essentially means, as I have already mentioned, restoration of the goods which have been taken away from the plaintiff, and this is the way in which the law of torts ensures that there are various remedies which are available with the plaintiff for the purpose of achieving the goal, and which is an appropriate remedy which has to be given in a particular case. Once again, depends upon a case to case basis. It depends upon the facts of the case. It depends upon the loss which is caused to the plaintiff. It depends upon the tort which is complained against, and it also depends upon the capacity of the defendant and the plaintiff in the first place. With this, we have finished the topic of torts, and in the next lecture, Professor Archita Narayanan is going to talk about property law. Thank you so much.